He called me and said, I've got things to share with you, but not over the phone.
He was a Chicago policeman. He was a high-level outfit guy, tied closely with Sam Giancana.
In Mexico, he was teaching polygraph to the federales and to the Supreme Court. The guy would go in with the voter to make sure that he pulled the lever for Ogilvy and then give him his $5. The FBI started following me, tried to flip me as an informant. Richard Cain knew the bad guys and understood them, and so that would help him develop these cases. I asked if Richard was indeed a killer, and he said,
Plus years after the murder of Richard Cain, I picked up his homicide file when I was in the cold case homicide unit of the Chicago Police Department. I had heard of Richard Cain. In fact, anybody who spent more than about 15 minutes studying Chicago history of Chicago crime, or Chicago outfit, knows the name Richard Cain. He was an infamous character in Chicago history of the 50s, 60s, and 70s. Army veteran, Chicago police officer, chief investigator for the Cook County Sheriff's Department, FBI informant, CIA operative, assassin, killer, con man. All of these titles Richard Cain either held or is alleged to have been. A very mercurial man whose true history is very difficult to pin down. And why should we care at this point? Another outfit murder, albeit one of the more infamous of all the Chicago outfit murders. Well, the possibility exists that he is a part of American history that we still don't have answers for, and that we don't quite understand. The rumors about Cain are endless. He trained Cuban refugees for the invasion of the Bay of Pigs, made an assassination attempt on Fidel Castro, worked with the FBI as an informant, was an outfit guy from the start throughout his police career, was a killer. All of those things I mentioned are part of the lore that is Richard Cain. So, to start season 2 of Detective Story, we're going to try and unravel that mystery and separate fact from fiction, and find out who Richard Cain really was before December 20th, 1973 at 1117 Grand Avenue in Chicago, when 3 masked men put a shotgun to his head and brought it into it all.
Hi, welcome back to Detective Story. Thanks for joining in again. Here we are at start of season 2, first episode, season, episode 20? So thanks again for joining in. We really appreciate it. We got some interesting stuff to talk about and an interesting caper to run down for you. I'm joined again, as always, my brother-in-law, Chris Kafcas.
Coming out 2025 with a bang on this one.
Yeah, this would be a cool one. How you doing?
Doing well. How about yourself?
Oh, good, man. No worries at all. Glad to be back.
So we got some exciting stuff happening. Mike, why don't you tell them a little bit about some of these, I guess you'd call them, I don't know, partnerships or?
Yeah, I suppose. So we got reached out by a group called Station, which is a podcast service, I don't know what you call them, my partnering service, I suppose. I think the Kelsey brothers.
It's pretty obvious we don't know what we're doing.
Yeah, right.
Having
you
fun.
haven't figured that out, then you're on the right show, Detective Story. But Station is a cool place, and I'll get those links into the show notes. But basically, it is a clearinghouse where you can find all of the episodes, and you also communicate directly with Chris and I, via message. We're going to run promotions on there. They'll do that for us. We'll see. It looks like a pretty cool opportunity and a really cool way to interact with you guys, and to put more of the pressure on Chris. So all your questions, really, you can direct towards him.
Yeah, direct them towards me.
Especially as they relate to the commission of crimes in relation to solving them. So
yes, the commission of crimes.
And then I don't know what this means, and people are going to laugh, and you can tell me. Hopefully, somebody from Amazon will. But Amazon is also gave us an opportunity to be an influencer on Amazon, which is pretty funny.
Influencers from way back. They're just finally recognizing our genius.
Right. So I don't know if that's we're going to be in the adult section. I don't know. We'll find that out as we go along. But anyway, yeah, so we got some cool stuff going on.
And then we're coming out 2025 with just a really exciting episode. Mike went out and interviewed the author of a book to show the peoples. It's a book written by the half brother of Richard Cain, written by Michael Cain. Richard Cain, Mike, is he was just a bad man.
Yeah, he was. So, anybody, Chicago historians, particularly people who are interested in the Chicago outfit mob, everybody's going to know that name, Richard Cain. I would say that, with the exception of the St. Valentine's Day Massacre, the most infamous outfit hit in this city's history was probably Richard Cain.
And, when we first started talking about it, you started to kind of give me a background. I thought he was kind of like he was a policeman, and I figured he was a crooked cop / hustler that small time, constantly just trying to pick up scores and get cash coming in. But getting into that book and further conversations with you, he was maybe a heavy hitter. I mean, maybe some connection to the Kennedy assassination. He had kidnapped a mob boss. I mean, he was not like a normal corner, like hang out on the corner kind of street hustler, right?
No, for sure. I mean, he was a man of many talents in a time period. It's like he's a guy that could have only existed in a time period in a place, right? Like 1950s, 1960s Chicago. I think he could only exist in that time period in that part of history. But yeah, he was a Chicago police officer. He didn't last very long because he was corrupt from the get-go. He was very close with Sam Giancana, who was the boss of the Chicago outfit for years.
A lot more in-depth knowledge, but would you say that he was corrupt as he was he a skilled policeman?
Well, I think he was a smart, street sharp guy, and so that lends itself to being a good policeman. I think the problem with him, they got, in the short time that he was on the job, him and his partner Jerry Shallow got a bunch of accommodations, got a bunch of notoriety. But the problem with that was he always had a back door. He was stealing money. He had friends who were writers who he's feeding information to.
This is like a movie. It's like that movie that we saw so long ago, Infernal Affairs, right?
Yeah, I mean,
sorry, was I supposed to not plug that?
It's all right. No, they're happy to have it since Scorsese stole it from him.
Stole. Now we're in trouble.
Now we are in trouble. Borrowed. He gave credit to a little bit at the very end if you watch the credits long enough. But anyway, yeah, I mean, well, in the interview that we're going to show as part of these episodes with Michael Cain, Michael invited me to his house. This happens in that when I picked this book up and read it, Tangled Web, The Life and Death of Richard Cain, Chicago Cop and Hitman.
Can I see this real quick?
Of course.
Had it not been for the plethora of notations, I wouldn't have believed that he actually read the book. But this is more noted than a biblical scholar.
Yeah, well, so, and that's true. I mean, by this time, the reason that happens is I knew I had several conversations. The way this shakes out is when I was a young man, I had heard of Richard Cain and was interested in it, read some stuff about him. And then when I got assigned to the cold case homicide unit, I decided to pull that file and take a look at his murder. It was a kind of just a historical ego play because everybody's looked at that murder. It's going nowhere. There's no big shocker, I don't think, as to who actually killed him. At least Joey Lombardo, if he didn't do it, he knows who did do it because that was his territory. Nobody's doing anything about Joey's say-so. So in the end, it kind of that's the stopgap. But as far as solving it officially, it's going to be like the St. Valentine's Day Massacre. It's always going to be, I think, one of those things that people kind of know, but never enough to get done with. But so I reach out for Michael Cain, and we became friends, talked a bunch of times on the phone, and he agreed to be interviewed. And so I drove down to his place. He lives in the southern part of the United States, smoked a cigar with him and had a great conversation, which we recorded, and you'll see as part of this. But to your point, he makes the point in there that he thought about. So real quickly, Michael Cain's a accomplished author. I'll give you a little more of his background. We get into it, but did a lot of work with post-traumatic stress with our soldiers. And he's just a really good man. He is Richard Cain's half brother. They share the same father, but there's 17-year age difference. Richard's 17 years older, and Michael had not seen Richard since he was 11 years old. And at that time, Michael was 11 years old. Richard was still in the police department. Michael really looked up to him. He's bigger than life character.
Right.
Kind of was a bigger than life character. Just turns out wasn't a great guy at all. But so Michael had very little contact with him. His father had kind of cast Richard out because his father knew what Richard was up to, wasn't a good guy. And then, of course, like everybody else, he finds out about his murder, reads about it in the papers. Probably 7, 8, 9 years later, he decides he's going to look into it, start putting together information to write this book, which in total was about 20 years of research and talking to people. It's pretty fascinating. It's fascinating in a lot of ways. One of the things that fascinated me most was that in his initial Freedom of Information Act requests, he would get, because they were forced to after that, the FBI, the CIA, right. Chicago Police Department, but they would be so heavily redacted that it would like have a title, a name, and then no information, right? And he talks about that. But then later there was a court decision where a federal judge told them all, can't do that. Unless somebody's at risk or an operation's directly at risk that you can show, you got to release them. So then Michael, out of the blue, starts getting packages delivered to him with these old FYI, and some of the stuff he found out was crazy. And he makes the point in there, to your point, that he thought about writing this as a fictional novel, but then he realized when it started coming out,
you can't make it up.
Nobody's going to buy any of it.
So the episode that you're going to see, that we're kind of introing right now, I just opened the book and look at, I just open a page like I'll sometimes do. And I open it to a page and they're talking about the kidnapping of a major mob boss, who didn't want to kick money up to Richard, who at the time was a policeman. And then they strip him down, hold him for a couple of days, and eventually the guy relents. And, it's like this guy was like, he was larger than life, a criminal, but I mean, he's like a character. He's like the supervillain out of a movie. You can't make it up.
No, and there's been references to him, like James Ellroy, I think, an American tabloid, referenced either Cain or a guy like Cain who was could get everything done and was everywhere. And again, when I started the research post my cold case look into his actual murder, and kind of when we decided we're going to do an episode about him, and I have these conversations with Michael, I thought there's just no way all of the shit said about him can be true, because if you just took the blanket of rumors and stories about Richard Cain on their face, he, was robbing, killing people as a Chicago policeman and resigned before he got caught, and gets hired as the chief investigator for the Cook County Sheriff by Sheriff Richard Ogilvie, who was widely believed to be a clean politician, which in Illinois, even now, but especially in the 50s, was like, well, what?
Far be it from me to accuse our elected representatives of corruption, but
right.
But he and during his time, he uses that time as a Cook County Sheriff, chief investigator, to commit more crimes.
Yeah.
I mean, it's awesome. He's like forgot his name, the Dawn guy.
Oh yeah. Right. From the Chinatown episode. Right. Very similar people. Opium Dawn. Right. Yeah. So, I mean, and that's the start. There's rumored to be on the grassy knoll during the JFK assassination. One of the shooters, along with Chuck Nicoletti, another infamous outfit guy, rumored to have hosted Bautista, the ousted dictator of Cuba, rumored to have trained Cuban refugees for the failed
Bay of Pigs
thing.
Yeah.
It's like, how does one guy get involved in all of this in one lifetime? Can't be true, right? Well, you'll hear in this interview, not all of it is true. A lot of it's still unproven. A lot of it was true. I mean, he did live a lot of that life.
But even if you take like, if you, let's say 40% of it is true, that 40% is like insane.
Yeah, and I would say it's more like 85% of it's true.
Right. Which, you know, I mean, this puts him up there as in the category of like supervillain.
Yeah. Right. I mean, you're probably asking yourself the question that we've asked, why hasn't somebody made a movie about this guy? Well, hold on. I think that's a strong possibility. I'm hopeful for Michael anyway, but
I'm playing the role of Richard Cain.
And very similar glasses,
Yes.
as you can see.
That's why I got these glasses.
Right. So anyway, that's what we got today. We're going to let you listen to the interview I did with Michael. It's pretty cool. It's pretty interesting. He's a fascinating, intelligent man who has a direct link to this crazy part of American history.
It's a crazy part of and it's a crazy part of Chicago history. If you're from Chicago, like this is one of the most fascinating stories that come out of the city that I've ever heard. And I've heard a lot of stories.
Yeah, agreed. And we smoked a couple of good cigars, which is right in my wheelhouse. So let's get to it.
There you go. Enjoy the next episode. We'll see you all soon.
Hi, this is Mike Hammond. I'd like to take a little break from the show to tell you about my friends over at Blue Knight Security Solutions. Blue Knight Security Solutions is an all-encompassing security and investigative services company that can provide any of your security needs, whether it be investigations, commercial security guards, residential security, special events, even personal investigative services, or threat vulnerability assessments for your company, for your family, for your home. They can do all of this. Executive protection and transport for you and your family whenever needed. They can do it all. These guys are professionals. They're good at what they do. I highly recommend them. You can reach them at BlueKnightSecuritySolutions.com or reach out to me anytime and I'll connect you with them. Blue Knight Security Solutions.
All right, Michael, welcome to Detective Story. Thank you so much. This is one of the real great honors of the show to have you as your guest here. Have us as your guest means a lot to me. It really does.
I'm happy to do it.
Yeah, so for our listeners, we have here Michael Cain, who I described in the opener. He is Richard Cain's half brother. Wrote this amazing book, Tangled Web, which you can see. I have taken a lot of notes in, read extensively. It's fantastic work. Congratulations just on that, the research on that.
Thank you.
You said 20 years or something you researched
not
it?
full time, but it took a long time. There were things that people didn't want me to know.
Yeah.
And I had to dig and scratch and find people who were willing to talk.
Uh-huh.
And the biggest delay was when I got a phone call one day from an FBI agent, Bill Romer, telling me that a book was to be published, released the next day. And in the book that Richard was going to be pegged as the shooter in Dealey Plaza, killing John Kennedy.
Yeah, talking about the Kennedy assassination, right?
And I didn't think that he could have done it, partly because he couldn't see well enough to fire a rifle accurately. But I knew that intellectually he was capable of doing it. So I wanted to know. I got involved with...
And what year are we talking about here, you think about?
That was in probably 86 or 7.
Mm-hmm.
So I got involved with the JFK research community and spoke at they had a convocation every November. And I explained who I was and that this book had named Richard as the shooter. If anybody in this community has any evidence to support that, I'd like to know about it. I'm not afraid to deal with it if it's true, but I don't believe it's true, and I want to see evidence. So after 10 or 12 years of going to those meetings, I found the answers in Chicago, which is where I figured I'd find them. I spoke with two guys, one patrolman was a detective actually with the Cook County Sheriff's Police. He told me about an incident where he was involved in arresting a guy on a drug charge, and they got into a shootout. Jimmy got shot in the foot, which isn't a huge tragedy, but it implanted in his mind the day that he was at the grand jury to get an indictment against the shooter. And he said that Richard was there with him.
Which is an interesting date, right?
Yeah. Right. It's hard to forget those dates.
Yeah, that's November 22nd, 1963 was that date,
Exactly.
which is really how you solidified that he could not have been there in Dallas, right?
Yeah, but it was, I also met another guy who worked with Richard. He was never a part of the Cook County Sheriff's Police. He was kind of a freelance guy, a tough guy. And he also recalled that he wasn't at the grand jury room, but he was at the bar afterwards when they got to talk about it all. So that's two people who didn't have very much, at that time, had no contact with one another. And they both told me the same story. So I was satisfied at that point that he didn't do it.
So can we go back a little bit here? So for my listeners, just most people who are going to turn into this are going to know, but I think a lot of Chicago outfit historians, aficionados, the most notable of all Chicago outfit murders, of course, is the St. Valentine's Day Massacre. I think that a lot of people would argue probably that the second most famous or infamous Chicago outfit murder was Richard Cain. Michael, you are his half brother. You share the same father, correct?
That's correct.
And Richard Cain, and I talk about this in the intro, but he was a mercurial guy who really existed in a lot of worlds. He was a Chicago police officer. He was fired from Chicago Police Department. He was a Chicago outfit insider. He was very close, always close with Sam Giancana. He did work with the CIA, which is documented. It's an amazing story from start to finish. He is one of Chicago's great iconic characters without question. So let's, if you don't mind, let's go back just a little bit. You detail this in your book, and you're quite a bit younger than Richard, right?
17 years younger.
17 years younger, right? So how much time, I think you told me that last time you really saw him or spent time with him, you were 11 years old?
Correct.
That's right. And that's also documented.
That's in the book.
Yeah. And then growing up, did you have a lot of interaction with him? Some interaction? How would you describe that?
We saw him at least twice a year. We lived in Michigan, Bay City, Michigan. And so in those days, it was a 5 or 6 hour drive from Chicago. Well, probably 4 or 5. Richard had a lead foot. So we saw him regularly, and as kids, we thought he was cool. He was obviously he was a cop. He had told great stories, and and we all looked up to him. When I first had a hint of his awkward leanings was when Harry Fiegel was killed in 1959. The press reports all talked about how Richard and his partner Jerry Shallow had encountered this guy behind the bus station, the Greyhound bus station downtown, and tried to arrest him, but he pulled out a gun and started shooting, and he lost the battle. That's the story that Richard told. That's the story that was in the newspapers. And Richard was given a commendation by the Chicago Police Department.
The official police version
Yeah.
of that. And Fiegel was he'd been arrested as a pedophile, as a kind of pimp for young.
And the word on the street in those days was that he was what they called a fruit hustler. He preyed on gay men and would get them into a compromising situation and then extort money from them. Richard was inclined to do the same sort of stuff, and his relationship with Fiegel then was one of Fiegel stole money from people, and he was supposed to share a portion of that with Richard. And something happened in that relationship, but it was nowhere near the bus station. For years, I believed the official story. When I started researching the book, I spent a lot of time with the Freedom of Information Act, getting documents from the federal government.
So I'm sorry to interrupt real quick, but he was killed December 20th, 1973, Richard was, right? And Rose's Sandwich Shop on Grand and just west of May over there, just east of May, about 1100 block of West Grand. So this is 1973 that he's killed. When did you start to, when did that transition of you starting to question that story, that particular story, did that happen before, while he was still alive, or later?
It was later.
Much later, when you'd started doing research.
Right.
So if I recall our conversation, so to our listeners, you and I have talked on the phone for hours a couple times, right? Mm-hmm. Which I really appreciate. So the way this shakes out is, I have read this book years ago, and I had interest, and when I was in Cold Case, I actually looked into Richard's murder, did some work on it. It's a very difficult case, which is an interesting thing that we can get into in itself. But, and I believe I'd read this book. I wasn't sure, but then I went back and looked, and I realized, well, you're actually related to him. And then, so I reached out to you, and you're kind enough to get back to me, and we had a couple of really cool, long conversations. Mm-hmm. So that, just to give a little perspective here, on our relationship and how this gets started. And I really appreciate you sharing so much with me, being so it was fascinating for me. So I went back and reread the book again, or read it more thoroughly, and fascinating, amazingly well researched. And congratulations on that. You really did a great job.
Thank you.
But back to the point. So your research then, and then you start to question the facts behind the Fiegel, right? Is the last name, murder. That what time period are we talking then? Is that
the research part of it?
After, as compared to his murder, 73.
Okay. Well, I started seriously researching it in the early 80s.
Okay.
One of the places that I went to, actually sometime later, because it never occurred to me at the time that there would be a Freedom of Information Act in the state of Illinois. I finally did, and among the things that I got in that effort was a letter from Fiegel's attorney, in which he laid out a completely different scenario that really rang true. and so I dug a little deeper, talked to some more people, and sure enough, there was enough evidence to satisfy me that Fiegel was taken into custody on the South Side, probably murdered there, and then deposited behind the bus station
By Richard.
And Jerry Shallow.
So I'm sorry to interrupt. I swear I won't do this to you too much, but I have two questions related to that. One, what was kind of your motivation to start? I mean, he's your half brother, so you're going to have curiosity, but was there something that like triggered you in the early 80s there to say, I want to know what happened here? You know, is there something in particular, or is it just something that nagged you?
I'm not sure if it was something I can define, but I wanted to know why he was killed and by whom, because if you read the newspaper accounts at the time, everybody was at fault: the mob, the CIA, the FBI, and I really wanted to know what happened. So my first genuine effort in researching was I had a friend who worked for St. Jude's research facility, and he was hosting a dinner. He was the fundraising chief. He was hosting a dinner in Chicago at which Jack Mabley was going to be the featured speaker. So I reached out to my friend and said, "Would you please give this note that I sent him to Jack Mabley?"
And Mabley was a pretty famous...
He was a famous columnist and reporter, worked for, at one time or another, all of the newspapers in Chicago. Mm-hmm. And so I sent a note to him and said, "I'm Richard Cain's brother. I'd like to have a conversation with you. How do you feel about that?" So he called me and said, "I've got things to share with you, but not over the phone." I said, "Well, that certainly was intriguing." So I was living in California at the time and found a reason to go to Chicago and spend an afternoon with Jack. And he told me that one of the things that always troubled me and others in the press in Chicago was that Mabley always defended Richard, even though he had to have known that he was corrupt. And so I asked him about that. How do you explain yourself? And he said, "Well, we used one another. He was a great source for me. He got me information and stories that I wanted to write about. And I mentioned his name in my column, which pleased him. Mm-hmm. He was a sucker for anybody who would give him publicity." So my final question to Jack was on that day. I mean, we had a number of meetings later, but I asked if Richard was indeed a killer. And he said, "Yeah, I think so." He said, "But, he never killed anybody that didn't deserve it."
Yeah, right.
I said, "Well, it's a pretty twisted way of looking at things."
The Chicago way.
Yeah.
I've heard that
right.
a few times.
So then I was off to the races from there. I learned about the Freedom of Information Act, and I reached out to the FBI, obviously, the CIA, the Bureau of Prisons, the Justice Department, and there was a lot of pushback. I got at one point I got a 35-page document from the FBI, and there were literally less than 3 paragraphs that were legible. Everything else had been blacked out,
redacted. Yeah.
So I met Bill Romer somewhere along the line, an FBI agent, and I was chatting with him one day, and I mentioned that the frustration that I feel when I get these documents and they're all redacted. He said, "Well, like what? Give me an example." So I pulled that one out, and what was legible was the date, the fact that it was addressed to Mr. Hoover, and very few other serious details. And he said, I remember that. I wrote that memo. And he told me what was in it, which really was a turning point for me, because I heard what I accepted as confirming information about Dick's corruption and his relationship with the FBI. So I said, I got to keep going.
Yeah.
Eventually, there were laws passed that tightened up the Freedom of Information Act so that organizations like the FBI and the CIA couldn't just automatically say, no, we're not going to share that. They had to give a reason.
Yeah, there was a court decision that forced them to release more, right? Yeah.
Right. So from that point forward, I started getting loads of information from the FBI. The CIA was still pushing back. The Bureau of Prisons was very open. The fact that I would get a package of information, in some cases that was 4 or 5 years old, my request, and they'd suddenly send me a stack of paper, 5,000 pages, and there were fewer redactions at that point.
But what were your feelings? I mean, was that like really excitement, or were you trepidatious of what you'd find, or you just?
By that time, I knew the context of what I was going to find, that he was corrupt, and so my focus shifted from curiosity to this would make a hell of a book.
Yeah. So real quick with that, were you aware, like as you were growing up, or before you got into this, were you aware of, like, the thing that's always struck me about Richard is, like, if everything is to be believed, let's go with the whole story. He was a Chicago policeman who was always an outfit guy, who was a high level outfit guy, tied closely with Sam Giancana. He took part in the Kennedy assassination. He trained Cuban refugees for the invasion of Bay of Pigs, worked with the CIA on that. He was going to take over the Chicago mob. Were you aware of all those stories that were out there, or did you kind of learn that as you started doing the research?
Yeah, I wasn't aware of much of anything when I started, except that he had been a cop, and then he went to the sheriff's department and was a pretty senior person there. And it all at some point I said, this is not going to be a fairy tale story. This is some bad stuff, and I was troubled by how could Dick Ogilvy, who was the sheriff of Cook County, have made such an obvious stupid mistake in
later
hiring
become
him.
the governor of Illinois, right?
And later became governor. So I started to try and focus on that. Did he make an honest mistake, or was he corrupt?
Mm-hmm.
And the answer to that turned out to be somewhere in the middle. He knew that Richard was corrupt when he hired him, but he believed that he could control him and in such a way that it wouldn't embarrass the department, which was a pretty naive position on his part.
Yeah, Richard was able to kind of play that off by this belief that I think happens sometimes, and sometimes it is true, which makes it more complicated, right? That if you're really going to get the kind of information that Richard gets, like the inside information on the outfit, and share that kind of, and have like access to these high level players, you're going to get accused of some stuff, right? So that's what may have been Ogilvy's thought, like, he's really, you got to seem a little dirty to be able to play that game. He's really not that bad, right? Or some version of that, right? And it turns out he probably was. Ogilvy was being naive, as you.
It was also being his own level of corrupt, because before he actually hired Richard, he went to a meeting with a group called the West Side Block, which consisted of 5 or 6 high-level outfit guys and some local politicians. They and I'll back up a little bit. The reason that Richard was involved in that election was that after he was fired by the sheriff's department. No, I'm sorry, backing it up. After he left the Chicago PD, he went to Mexico, and in Mexico he was teaching polygraph to the federales and to the Supreme Court in Mexico, and it never really took off. He was also doing some clandestine work for somebody, I don't know. But he stayed in touch with Ogilvy, who he had met in 57, I think it was 59, when Tony Accardo was tried for tax evasion. Ogilvy asked the chief of detectives for an investigator that he could use on this case. They gave him Richard for some unknown reason, but it also implies that the chief of D's was corrupt as well, because he certainly knew that Richard was off. So I don't know if you know the story about that case, but
yeah, I read about it in your book, so I do know.
Okay, he was convicted, but the conviction was overturned on appeal, and
The only conviction that Accardo ever took.
right, and he never spent a night in jail.
Yeah.
Bill Romer told me that while that case was progressing, he found out that somebody in the outfit, not Richard, I don't think, but it could have been, somebody got a hold of the jury pool. So they had a meeting at the clothing store on Washington or Michigan, and they had 5 or 6 guys in the room going through the list, looking for somebody that somebody could approach and pay him off to deliver a hung jury. Anyway, Romer found out about that, went to the judge, and said, "I can't tell you how I know this."
Because the G had the clothing store wired, right? Yeah.
And but you got to change the jury pool. So and they didn't announce that until the first day of jury selection. So they struck out there. But they, as I said, they won on appeal. And I keep getting in a time warp here. I spoke to Tom Foreign at some point, who prosecuted Richard, and he was also the prosecutor on that case. So I told Tom Foreign that I had read the transcript of Richard's trial, and there was no time in that transcript that I saw physical evidence produced that tied Dick to the crime. And
that was the federal conspiracy.
The federal conspiracy after the fact of a bank robbery, and
right.
And I said, I'm not trying to imply that he was innocent. I'm trying to understand your process, and my guess is that I know that Richard filed a motion for severance so that he would be tried separately from the other guys. The other guys were all pre-convicted. I mean, there was so much evidence against them that Foreign wanted to keep Richard on that indictment because there was so much evidence against those guys that the jury was just going to convict everybody, which is in fact what happened. But he disagreed with me. He said there was actual evidence tying Dick, and I'm skeptical, but there is one page missing from the transcript that I have, so it could have been that's where it was discussed.
And what we're talking about here basically is that often in these trials, and a prosecutor, of course, when you got really strong case, you want them lumped together, right? It makes an easier case. It makes them look like, and if you are a defendant and the attorney for the defendant, and you of the group of conspirators, the evidence is weakest against your client, you want to be separated. You want to try everything you can to get a separate trial, right? Which is what Richard's attorney tried to do. Or Richard was his own attorney,
himself,
right? And acted as his own attorney, and he worked hard. And that's what you're talking. It would have been very difficult to, the way I read it too, it looks like it had been very difficult to have convicted him. Again, not that he wasn't responsible or guilty or culpable, but the evidence just was not very strong. Where so he was unsuccessful in doing that. Richard was getting it separated out, so they were tried together, and he was convicted. Right. That's what. Just to back up a little bit to give us some.
Can I ask a quick question?
Yes, please.
So my curiosity is, do you think that the sheriff, when he hired Richard, knowing that there was probably a degree of corruption in his past, that corruption in a way could put him in a better position to make arrests and elevate him or his position by being able to convict people that he might not have been able to convict because Richard was able to provide information that he might not have had access to?
That was the hope. Richard's, whenever Ogilvy was cornered on that question, his response was typically that Richard Cain knew the bad guys and understood them, and so that would help him develop these cases. And there are very few cases that you can point to that Richard was behind the conviction. How he got away with what he was playing there was just incredible to me, because, and again, I believe that Ogilvy knew exactly what he was getting with Richard Cain, that he was mobbed up. And I met a guy, who I won't name right now, but you probably know the name. And I said that this was, the way he operated. And he said that this guy was with the sheriff's department. And he said, he started telling me about his hero and mentor, a guy who I have been told was as corrupt as Richard. And he said, this guy was so smart, and he said he'd take me around town, and we'd see a gangster sitting at a table, and they'd say, "Hi, how you doing? Come on over and have a drink." And I said, "Did you not think that was moderately suspicious?" "Oh no, this guy was totally straight as an arrow." I said, "Well, okay, check off the naive box for this guy." The Chicago police world in those days was so bizarre, in my opinion, because there were levels of corruption. Art Bielek, you know that name?
Yes.
Okay.
I don't know a lot about him, but I probably maybe from you.
Well, Art was a lieutenant in the Chicago PD and recruited by Ogilvy to come to the sheriff's department to run the patrol division. Art pitched Ogilvy on creating this new anti-organized crime operation that he thought he could do really well with, and Ogilvy said, "No, that's already been handled." But nobody knew that he had hired Richard until after the election. Bielek from what I've learned, and I got to know him pretty well during my research. He's the kind of a guy that I heard you refer to a guy like him as real police. Dead straight arrow. When he started with the police department, he was offered the weekly or monthly payoffs, and he said, "I don't want it." And I said, "Well, you didn't want it, but tell me about the culture that allows that to go on when you know it's happening and you disapprove of it. Did you talk to your sergeant or your lieutenant or the chief?" And he said, "You couldn't tell who was who." So I just kept my mouth shut and did my job. But he was he told me some great stories, and he always impressed me as being totally honest. Not, I mean, he didn't embrace me and tell me everything he ever knew, but the things that he did tell me all checked out with, when I had an opportunity to check them. But he and Richard were peers on the Cook County Sheriff's Police. He and Art Bielek in charge of patrol, and Richard in charge of the detectives.
Yeah, so just as a quick timeline, real quick, for my listeners, Richard Ogilvie had been a prosecutor. He was a rising star, and that continued. He ran for sheriff. He won sheriff. He ended up being the governor of the state of Illinois. What makes this so dynamic, and I know what I could tell in your book and what you're talking about now was, by all accounts, Ogilvie seemed to be very straight, very, and Richard had been a Chicago police officer, but he'd been fired, been mired in a bunch of corruption by pretty much everybody. It was pretty well known throughout the city, reporters, that Richard was mobbed up and connected in some way. And Ogilvie, in a really shocking move, hires Richard as his chief investigator. That's, I mean, I'm just giving a timeline there to kind of explain why, for you being an outsider, not a Chicago guy, really, even for me as a Chicago guy, years much younger than that, it's like, that just doesn't make a lot of sense. Although, we've had so many governors go to prison in the state of Illinois, it's like, nothing's quite legit, right? So, probably, and back then, it certainly probably wasn't. Not, I don't have the information to cast aspersions on Ogilvie, but certainly that was a more than questionable decision, right? I mean,
absolutely. And when I started to talking earlier about Richard going to Mexico, while he was in Mexico, he kept up a regular correspondence with Ogilvie. I want to also correct you on one point. He was not fired by the Chicago PD. He resigned.
Oh, you're right. I'm sorry. That's correct.
And that was a negotiated settlement in order to save Jerry Shallow's job. He stayed with the PD until he got fired later for stealing a car. But so he stayed in touch with Ogilvie. And then when Ogilvie announced he was running for sheriff, Richard told him that no Republican is going to win the race for sheriff. This is a Democratic area. He said, but I can get you elected. And if I get you elected, this is what I want from you, is that job. One of the sources that I worked with told me that during that election, they had guys at the polling places waiting to identify a particular type of voter, and they would offer him $5 to vote for Ogilvie. And he said in many cases, they actually, in those days, they had the booths with the curtain that closed around him. The guy would go in with the voter to make sure that he pulled the lever for Ogilvie and then give him his $5. There was apparently a lot of that going on at the time.
Right. Yeah. Yeah, that's the bad joke about Chicago. You know what I mean? Make sure you get out and vote many times as you can.
Early and often.
Early and often, right. So I want to back up a little bit too, again, for my listeners. One of the interesting dynamics with Richard was he was in the military, the Army.
He was in the Army.
And he got stationed he learned to speak Spanish. He spoke Spanish fluently, right, in the military. And that's how, that plays a big part later in his life. Not just, when things kind of go sideways in Chicago or get slow, he goes to Mexico, gets hired, some pretty high level jobs there in Mexico, works in Mexico, which you document in your book really well. And also ends up working with the Cubans, refugees, and for the invasion of the Bay of, training them basically for what was supposed to be the invasion of the Bay of Pigs, right? So that piece of the puzzle of him is really interesting. That learning the Spanish language and played a big part in his life throughout his life.
He did, and he had a bit of a leg up because he spoke Italian, and it's a similar language.
Because you share the same father. His mother was
Italian.
Italian, right?
Yeah, and her father emigrated to the United States in 1901, I think, somewhere around there. And one of the stories that you see a lot about Richard is that his real name is Scalzitti, which was in fact his father-in-law's given name. But when he came to Chicago, he changed it. I'm not sure why, probably to Americanize it, because there was a lot of anti-Italian sentiment back in the 20s and 30s.
Richard's father-in-law we're talking about here, right? Yeah.
Ole Scully. He changed his name from Olimpio Scalzitti to Ole Scully, O-L-E.
Well, not his father-in-law. It had been his grandfather. Yeah, right. I'm sorry. Yeah, his mother's
father.
Yeah, correct.
So he I forgot where I was going with that.
We're talking about the Italian Spanish connection of language.
So when he got out of the Army, lived in Miami for 3 years, and worked for a private detective agency there. And one of the things that they had him do was to go to Cuba and install wiretaps for Batista. Batista was a typical strongman, and he
dictator really of Cuba at the time.
So he spent a lot of time in Miami, and of course, just being in not in Miami but in Cuba. But even just being in Miami, you got to learn Spanish. So when he left Miami in '53, he went to Chicago. His wife at the time was from the Virgin Islands, and she hated Chicago, and never missed an opportunity to tell him so. But when the Bay of Pigs started developing, he was actually recruited. I don't have any firm documentation of this, but Batista asked him to get involved in training these guys. And while that training was going on, Batista actually came and stayed in Richard's house for a week. Well, he would go out to the airbase and
Glenview, right?
Yeah, and talk to the guys and keep them motivated. And everybody denies that happened, but I've spoken to 3 people who were there, and they've all told the same story.
Yeah, so that's an amazing piece of history right there, right? Because Batista, who everybody knows the story of Fidel Castro, the Cuban Revolution. Batista is the dictator that is pushed out by the Castro Revolution, and that kind of personal relationship between Richard and him, which you're able to document to the point where he's coming and staying in Richard's house, and
that really amazed me when I was reading the book, because I honestly, at some point I started writing a lot of like, all this can't be true. Right. I mean, the one guy, I mean, we're talking about like a combination of James Bond and Forrest Gump here, right? He's like everywhere. It can't be all of this. And then, but in reading your book, you're able to document so well like that, just that fact that he had this relationship with Batista. Like, wow, I probably was way underselling his reach.
Well, it's incredible to think about what he did accomplish and what he could have accomplished if he had been an honest man. The whole business with when I started doing the research, I would tell very few people what I was doing. But those that I did share it with said, geez, you ought to fictionalize that. I said, as fiction, it's totally unbelievable.
How about it?
I mean, it's such a bizarre story that I had to tell it as truth.
Yeah. Hey, welcome back. So here you go. The end of episode 1, my interview with Michael Cain about his half-brother, Richard Cain.
What a story.
Yeah, it's
more to come.
Yeah, it's
Episode 2.
amazing, right? I mean, it's just crazy. Crazy. I'm blown away by it. See, Michael has got a sharp mind. It was a really fun conversation. I would give a shout out to our buddy Brian Liturgy, who was working the camera for us on that day.
Just for little reference, Brian, 3-time Olympic athlete.
That's true. Good friend to the show. Good friend of both of ours. You see, episode 2 will be pretty interesting. I think we'll wrap up this crazy story.
I'm telling you, you loved episode number 1. You're going to love episode number 2.
Yeah, we'll get to the meat of some of those stories and wrap this up and try and get to the bottom of, who was he? How much of it was true? How much of it is legend? And so we'll take it from there.
Oh, fantastic. Look forward to episode number 2. We'll see you soon.
Yeah, thank you very much. Thank you to the sponsors, as always, Blue Knight Security, and you guys. Thanks so much. We'll talk to you soon.